Hello, I'm Sue Andersen, grief guide and yoga teacher, dedicated to helping individuals navigate the challenging journey of loss. Welcome to Growth from Grief, where I aim to offer strategies to transition from the depths of grief to the path of healing. Whatever loss you are grappling with, here you'll discover support to ease both the physical and emotional burdens of grief. Together, let's embark on a journey towards strength, peace, and healing. I'm so glad you are here. Hi, and welcome back to Growth from Grief. I'm Sue Andersen, your host. And in today's episode, I want to talk a little bit about the 5 stages of grief and other research that I find very interesting. Now, first, let me just remind you that I am not a clinician. I have no medical training, but I am interested in these studies because as a yoga teacher, my focus is on what's happening in body, mind, and spirit, right? And we know that grief does have an effect on the body physically, the mind, cognitively, certainly emotionally, and yes, spiritually, or, spirituality, or from the standpoint of just traditional religion. All of those areas are affected when we experience loss. Now, clinicians, doctors, they're going to do a lot of research to try to substantiate what, I guess, Eastern philosophies like yoga and other types of traditional medicines have found in terms of how we can heal ourselves with our breath, with movement, with sound, with mindfulness. So anyway, I'm just kind of interested in this and thought that having this discussion might be helpful to you. And so you might be familiar with the 5 stages of grief. And the 5 stages of grief was introduced by Elizabeth Kübler-Ross in 1969 in her book on death and dying. And that book was based on her clinical research, her clinical experience working with patients who were dying. And she came up with these stages of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance that she saw that these people that were dying kind of went through. Over the years, these stages were sort of stamped into our collective consciousness, if you will, as the stages that grievers go through. So people who have experienced loss and are grieving. And for those of us who have gone through a loss and maybe have been exposed to these 5 stages of grief, there might be some confusion, right? Because these 5 stages of grief sound like a linear progression, right? First it's this, then it's this, then it's the next thing. Of course, if you're listening to this podcast and you have experienced a loss, you know that that's definitely not a linear experience, right? Grief is not linear. And so, if you have thought about grief in this way, in this linear progression, you might be thinking, oh my gosh, I'm not out of the anger phase, or I haven't gotten to the anger phase, or wow, I'm, really depressed And does that mean that, my next stage is acceptance? And so it's a little bit confusing. And I think that um, we all could probably do better if we didn't focus on those. But sometimes people bring that up, or again, you may have read about it and, just wondering, gee, where am I in these stages of grief? When I started learning more about this, which is probably only a few years ago, as I've been doing, different trainings and exposing myself to more aspects of grief from the standpoint of studies and research, just to understand a little bit more. What I did find is that there's also other stages and theories around this. So I did a training back in 2020. It was a short online training that talked about theory and therapeutic application of yoga. And I recently redid it just because I was kind of curious again, because it did introduce me as a yoga teacher to these different theories of grief, including the Kübler-Ross stages. It's not really necessary to specifically talk about what they are. I can link into the show notes if you're curious about some of these other studies. But over the years, one thing that seems to be happening is that the communities are looking more at, but by communities, I mean the medical community, the community that studies, the clinical community, right, and the medical community. So the other thing I learned in this is there are different areas of research around grief. So there's people that are looking at grief from the clinical standpoint. If you go to a grief counselor, for example, or a psychiatrist or something, they're looking at it from that perspective, and that might have to do with how does it affect our thinking, that sort of stuff. And then there's the biological aspect of it. So how does it affect our bodies, our biology, how we're made, right? How does grief affect us in that aspect? And the interesting thing about that, in a recent article that I've read, that was about the biology of grief in the New York Times, and again, I'll link to that if you're curious, is that there isn't a combined study that looks at the grief from the aspect of clinical research, again, that clinician's aspect of it, and the biological standpoint of it, which maybe is more medical, and I'm actually not sure. But anyway, there aren't too many studies that look at the person holistically, is what I'm getting at. But when I was reading through these different things, I saw that over time, the research is getting a little bit more into this aspect of how grief is affecting us physically. And as a yoga teacher, as someone who's done training focused on the whole individual, I was very pleased with that, I guess is a good word, and also um, very happy to see that this aspect of the research was being focused on how grief affects the body and what we can do about it, right? So there's a lot written about this, certainly, but again, these are like studies and research that are being done by scientists and clinicians. The other thing that I learned is that after loss, people have increased heart rates and high blood pressure. And maybe you know that, maybe you've experienced that. The brain sends stress hormones and other signals to the cardiovascular and immune system. So this is our sympathetic nervous system, and it just floods the body with cortisol. The fight or flight reaction takes place in the body. So that's where, you get that heart racing, maybe the high blood pressure, all these things around the heart. And we know from the standpoint of yoga that when you start feeling these stress hormones flooding the body, that focusing on the breath really helps kick in the parasympathetic nervous system and calms the body down, right? So it's sending different signals to the body. You can get the brain and the body to focus together on the breath, and that helps relax. The body relaxes as we focus on the breath. So, just kind of going back to the stages and phases of grief. One thing that's, I don't know, kind of nice about that when I think about it, right, is that I like stages. I like lists. I like, where I can check something off. And if you're like that, this idea of stages may appeal to you. Of course, I've already said there really aren't these stages. There are these feelings, there are these emotions that we feel, but they're not in any kind of order. But if you are a person that likes to tick off the boxes and say, okay, I'm done with this, I'm done with that, you might have to kind of think about a different approach to grieving, where it is a little bit unpredictable, right? You are going to feel all of these feelings. They are going to have an effect in your body. And you might notice, for example, that all of these feelings may be present when you experience the loss, but some are going to have a greater intensity than others. So your initial reaction of shock is going to be certainly more intense than anger, for example, because it's a shock to the system, right? So that's going to be forefront. Bewilderment, feelings like that. They're going to be right at the forefront. But as you move through your grief and your grief journey, and as you work through each of these emotions, then you're going to notice sort of this ebb and flow. I like to think about it as an echo effect. So imagine, if you will, that there's this blob. If you can kind of picture this, right? There's sort of this blob. Think of like an amoeba shape, right? So it's ever changing, this sort of blob, and that blob is your grief. And there's all these emotions that are kind of swimming in this blob, right? And they're depression and anger and shame and guilt and sadness, shock, all of the emotions that could come up while you're grieving. And they're kind of pulsing during these different phases, and they can come and go. So that's sort of the echo effect. So you may move along in the first year sort of, feeling like, okay, I'm feeling a little bit like I can get back into life. I can do a little bit more. And then, boy, whew, it's going to hit me again. And all of a sudden in my face, I feel extreme anger or depression, or something really pops up. So that's sort of the ebb and flow, right? That's that echo. And then the other emotions, maybe they're a little bit softer. I don't feel them as much. And then, oops, here comes another thing. So it's that, that blob that's moving with these emotions in it. And they're kind of, again, ebbing and flowing and echoing as you move along the path. This is, if you can, this is something to think about, because although you can't really check a box, right? You can't really check a box and say, I'm out of the anger phase, I'm out of the depression phase. You can notice this intensity over time. And you can also notice over time when it's important for you to work on something, So think about this. So, I'll give you an example of in my experience. So, shortly after my son died, maybe a month after, I just felt extreme anger. And I went outside and I was chopping and chopping and chopping a bush, right? Just like this bramble bush that I wanted to get out of the backyard. And I was hacking at it, hacking at it. And that was a way for me to release anger. And then that felt good for a while. It felt good for a while. But it wasn't like, oh, I'm done with anger. A couple years later, that anger came back, right? And it came back very strong. I was angry that this happened. I was angry that this happened to me. Why me? So that's just an example of how this emotions ebb and flow. So I've been thinking more about this idea of this amoeba, this shape with these pulsating emotions in it. And I want to get your opinion of this. I want to know what you think about this idea. So if you're interested in this idea and you want to see a graphic that I created, I would really love your opinion on it. So drop me a note or a message. You can contact me on Instagram, Facebook, go to my website, leave a comment, and just let me know if you would like to see this graphic and give me your opinion. That's it for now. I look forward to speaking with you in the next episode.